Good morning, my name is Marla and I represent Usborne Books and More. Yesterday, I told you a little secret about how our schools are failing our kids. And today, I'd like to teach you how you at home can help your kids go from mediocrity to excellence and succeed in school. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My parents got divorced when I was in second grade. And from then on, I went into public school from a parochial school. The schooling in a parochial school is vastly better than a public school. And some of the things that I encountered are my reasonings for homeschooling today and teaching my son to read. And one thing I want to mention is kids do not need to go to school until they're 7 or 8. And especially boys do not need to be in school sitting in a desk for 8 hours a day. That's absolutely a no-no, and that's probably one of the reasons I homeschool my son. He is a boy, and he is active, and he likes to play. And education really is about the student. It's not about the teacher, it's not about the parent. It's whether the student wants to learn and when and how. And boys, they are just not made up to sit at a desk and listen to a teacher for hours and hours a day. And some boys, they just don't take on to learning to read like girls do. They learn at their pace. They learn when they want to. And that is one of the reasons why I homeschool. I wanted to give my son that freedom to learn to read at his pace. One of the videos that I posted has to do with Rudolf Flesch's book, created over more than 6 decades ago in 1955. His book is called Why Johnny Can't Read, and I quote, he says, "The teaching of reading all over the world, all over the United States, in all schools and in all textbooks is totally wrong and flies in the face of logic and common sense." He warned this at that time, and I have to agree. He is right. He is absolutely right. And I've been teaching my son to read since he was 2, and I've watched him grow and develop into a reader. And he is still developing into a reader. He's currently now going into a process of being confident to read more books and harder books. And if you watched Peter Usborne, as he explains what went into developing his reading series, you will also learn that how could we abandon an intensive phonics instruction for a whole word instruction, for teaching sight words. Teaching reading on the basis of sound is the best way to teach English. And it's a better way to teach English than teaching by whole word method, as if the word method were like a symbol that you had to just memorize. It's not Egyptian language or anything like that. It's not, and this is probably the cause for the deterioration in reading skill, and probably one of the reasons why our country has such low proficiency rates and a high rate of learning disability. Yet many educators who are shaping our education policy and their positions in teaching colleges and publishing houses and government and other education bureaucracies, they did not listen then, and they still do not listen. In 1981, Flesch wrote a sequel to his book, and it's called Why Johnny Still Can't Read. And no matter the problem, it persists today. And it's not going to change until we change the way we teach reading. And it is changing. I heard there was an article on The Atlantic that said that teachers are teaching reading and reading alone. Well, you can't just teach reading for 8 hours a day. That is just not possible. When I homeschool, I belong to a community, a classical conversations community, and we go there once a week. And pretty much they tutor me on how to teach the subjects. And it's all memory work in the early years. And what we're doing is we're just putting in memory work of history, and doing fun science projects and doing fun art projects. And we're memorizing English words and English grammar, and we're learning math facts, and we're learning history facts and timeline, and then we have memory masters, and these things help me put in some of the stuff into memory so that later on my son can study it on his own. And all my job really has to do with is teaching my son how to read, because then later he can teach himself how to learn. And that's where I differ in, and another reason why I do not want to put my son in school is because I want to be proactive and I want to teach my son the basics. And so before I go into showing you what I do to teach my son to read, let me give you a little bit of history on what's going on today. So as far back as 1983, the feds themselves warned that the future of America hung in the balance. The educational foundation of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation. And a people, explained the President Ronald Reagan in his Commission on Excellence in Education. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well view it as a war, an act of war, because things have gotten worse, and they will get worse before they get better. And a growing number of Americans have come to realize that far too many Johnnies not only do not know how to read or write with any degree of proficiency, but are also handicapped in terms of their ability to add and subtract, or even to apply their minds to think critically. So, prior to the appearance of Why Johnny Can't Read in 1955, when the reading problem had already manifested itself, many more Johnnies were able to read proficiently than they are today. And this was true, in fact, prior to the rise of public education, and most children were taught in churches and schools or at home to understand what is happening. It is important to understand and to know the history and where we come from. So the first thing I want you to realize is that the first 2 centuries of American history, from the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s, public schools as we know them today did not exist. It's not that Americans in that time period didn't value education, because they did, and they actually value it much more than we do today. It's that instead of giving away their kids to the state to be educated by the state, for the state, almost all education was handled by the families, by religious institutions, by tutors, by private schools, and the free market. Early education then was typically a family affair. From the solid foundation developed at home, young literate citizens could easily continue their education if they chose using libraries. In 1831, Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, I think that's how you say his name, after traveling across America and studying it, commented on education of the time. And he said, quote, "In New England, every citizen receives the elementary notion of human knowledge. He is moreover taught the doctrines and the evidences of his religion, the history of his country, and the leading features of its constitution." De Tocqueville explained that in the states of Connecticut and Massachusetts, it is extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things, and a person wholly ignorant of them is a sort of phenomenon. Back then, a laissez-faire education worked, and it's what produced the freest and the wealthiest society in human history. Did you know that of the 117 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, the Article of Confederation, and the Constitution, 1 out of 3 had only a few months of formal education, and only 1 of 4 had gone to college? And did you know that Benjamin Franklin, widely regarded as a genius, was taught by his father to read before going on to study writing and arithmetic at a private school? And Thomas Jefferson, meanwhile, he was one of the writers of the Constitution, studied Latin and Greek under a tutor, and later attended classical academy run by a reverend. Back then, literacy was widespread, but now consider what's going on today with literacy. To make a long story short, I am an advocate for literacy, and what makes me an advocate for literacy is my own lack of high literacy growing up and not being taught how to read well. So this is my passion, and I want to educate and inform and motivate us to get back to the high ideals of literacy that we used to have. So before public schools, the Federalist Papers, do you know what those are? The Federalist Papers are papers written by our founding fathers, debating and discussing different ideas that the Congress of that time was coming up with. And those papers are proof that there was high literacy in those times, and how phenomenal our education system was without schooling. Our founding fathers had a classical education, and this is what I am giving my son today. I am giving him the classical education that our founding fathers had, and many of their contemporaries was much different than than what passes for schooling today. Not only that, but with the Bible at the heart of schooling in those days, early Americans understood the role of government to be a single one. Do you know what that is? To protect from evildoers the God-given rights to life, liberty, and property. And they understood the role of education as coming to know God and the scripture, gaining knowledge about creation, gaining knowledge, learning what was needed for a productive life, and learning to live right by God. I leave you with one quote, and I'm going to come back and give you another video because I'm not finished. But I'm going to leave you with one quote from John Milton. He said, "The end of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God's all right, and out of the knowledge to love Him, to imitate Him, to be like Him. that such views were dominant back then when Americans were far more educated.